So maybe the happiest decentralist revolution that's happening in front of us is, of course, in education, which is crumbling with a rapidity, I think, that is pretty astonishing to most of us. In just my own personal circumstances, I would say in the last 3 to 5 years, my own considerations of what my teenage children might do in the future, it has changed completely from sort of a, well, sure, they'll go to college, but maybe not some expensive grad school or something, to maybe they won't go to college. And that's fascinating if you think about it, because what colleges want to do is exactly the opposite of what they ought to do. They no longer want to teach a real classical liberal education, which is the one thing you ought to be getting when you're young and you have some time to study classics and history and literature and philosophy. So they don't do that anymore. They teach gender studies and wokeism and how to borrow money and how to hate your parents' guts. But the flip side is they do a really bad job of technical training. You go to 4 years of undergrad, you still don't know anything about being a nurse or a doctor or an automobile technician or an HVAC person or electrician or anything else. So, as it turns out that both technical training, other than perhaps maybe engineering, law, medicine, can be done at a technical school level or an online level, but also that classical liberal education, which I think people ought to have, is something you not only can, but now you really have to obtain on your own. You can go read Moby Dick without a $180,000 college professor, it turns out. So what I think's happening, though, over the past couple of months is the teachers' unions have had a meltdown, and the American people and American parents are starting to call their bluff. And they're saying, what do we need these guys for? If we're going to be online, why can't we just have the best social studies teacher in the country teaching every kid? Why do we have to have the crappy one at the middle school where I live? It's an interesting question, isn't it? And so what fascinates me, though, about this homeschool revolution is it used to be viewed as something that was kind of crankish, that oftentimes people on the left viewed homeschoolers as religious types, people who wanted to have their kids removed from society, people who were raising sort of cultish kids, and of course, worryingly to the left, people who were withdrawing their kids from the sort of left social indoctrination that they think every child needs to have. But now, because of COVID, for the first time, we're seeing a lot more sort of mainstream and left-wing people keep their kids home. And that is a development that I think bodes very, very well for our movement, because, once you realize you can keep your kid home, and once you start to see that flexibility, and once you start to think about the possibilities, I think that could be a sea change. So this isn't just something that's, some Mormons in Utah or some Baptists down in Alabama doing anymore. This is something that's going to come into the mainstream. And I think it's also going to dawn on people that education ought to be delivered more like a marketplace good or service. In other words, there ought to be some a la carte options. There ought to be some accountability. There ought to be some price competition. There ought to be some merit to the instructor. And this is going to be a very, very interesting development. And the final, I think, decentralist message that's happening is just the state and its financial situation. The idea that Uncle Sam is going to be able to continue to do what he does, remake Afghanistan in the image of Thomas Jefferson, much less fix potholes on Interstate 10 is very much in question. It is. Just 6 months ago or 12 months ago, it almost seems quaint. We were just fretting about $22 trillion in debt, or a $200 trillion fiscal gap between future entitlement promises we've made and, as an actuarial matter, the likely value of future tax receipts. $200 trillion gap, okay, which basically means the baby boomers are the last generation to get Social Security and Medicare. So those were the quaint problems we had 6 or 9 months ago. Add to that now what both Congress and the Fed have done. The Fed's balance sheet has gone from about $4 trillion to over $7. And I don't know if you saw Jerome Powell's speech the other day in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, But he basically acknowledged that inflation is going to be a thing because they've been doing their damnedest to tell us it's not a thing for the last 20 years. And apparently economists don't go to the grocery store. They don't pay copays at the doctor. I don't know who these guys are. But basically, Jerome Powell said something pretty profound. And the profundity is always buried in the details, isn't it? But they have this 2% inflation mandate, which is, of course, crazy. Because inflation is a process by which we all get poorer, whether it's 1 or 2%, or 20%. But nonetheless, they target 2% inflation in the economy. That would be quite a trick if you could do that, wouldn't it? But now he says, well, instead of targeting this, we're going to let inflation go a little hotter, which is just basically his way of acknowledging that the new money creation on the fiscal side by Congress and on the monetary side by the Fed is going to cause some pain and some price inflation. But instead of going for 2%, we're going to let it kind of go like this. Remember those in math, those sine waves, where you had kind of a line through the middle, but the wave was going like this? And so, we're just going to try to aim it for 2%. Let 2% be the line, but sometimes it can go up to 4. And it's been 0 for so long that it's okay if it's 4 for a while, because that'll average out to 2. Okay. I mean, what this is basically an acknowledgement, okay, that the people in charge don't know what they're doing any more than we do. Okay, we're on our own here. And that's a beautiful thing if we allow it to be so. So for the first time in U.S. history, for the fiscal year 2020, which ends October 1st, fiscal year versus calendar year, for the first time, we're going to have a federal deficit, a single-year deficit, that is as large or perhaps even exceeds tax revenues for the year. So the budget that Congress passed, nobody ever follows a budget that they pass. I mean, it's just a meaningless document. But the budget that Congress passed for 2020 was supposed to spend about $4.8 trillion. And the projection was that we would bring in about $3.7 trillion. Well, as it turns out, with the CARES Act, with all the federal unemployment benefits that are being paid, with potentially another round of federal unemployment benefits, which Trump wants to do, of course, to improve his own election chances. The federal government's going to spend something more like $7 trillion this year, maybe $8 trillion, and they're going to bring in maybe $4 trillion. So what you have is a situation where literally half of the federal government's operations for the year are funded by debt. And of course, the MMTers, for those of you who have been following modern monetary theory, say this is A-OK. This is not only A-OK, it could be 100%. And it can be for a while. I mean, there's some truth to that. The MMTers would go at it a little bit differently than how the Fed goes at it. But if we can do 50%, why not 80%? Why not 90%? And when you get into 80 or 90, we start to look more like Switzerland, where taxes are flipped, right? In Switzerland, very little is done at the federal level constitutionally, and political matters are pushed down to the cantons, the 26 cantons, which are the states in Switzerland, or to the communes, which are the cities in Switzerland. So if you're Swiss, you pay about 80% of your tax bill to your city or state, and only about 20% to the feds. That's flipped in the United States, isn't it? Well, that's interesting, though, if we start to look at how the federal government ostensibly finances its operations. We could reach a point very quickly where people across this country and governments across this country simply stop submitting federal tax receipts. I mean, at what point do you say it's all funny money and smoke and mirrors? At what point does a Kristi Noem say, we're going to finance this road ourselves? It's a very interesting experiment. I don't think we've ever been in this kind of situation before, because that these states and these governors are expecting a bailout. I mean, if you look at your town, somebody has to mow that grass by the side of the highway. Somebody has to pay the police. Somebody has to perform basic functions. We're not talking about new projects for which your city might float a bond. You don't issue bonds for basic maintenance and operations of your city. And the ability of cities and states to borrow money is very constrained. Do you want to buy muni bonds right now from Kenosha? I don't. So they're looking for a bailout from the federal government, and when you think about what probably second and third, especially third quarter tax receipts are going to look like for these states and cities with all the restaurants closed, all the retail dead in the water, so many people staying home. Nobody's buying gas hardly to drive. No one's going out to eat. No one's traveling. No one's going to hotels. I mean, they're going to want a bailout from the federal government. So this is the idea that the federal government is going to constrain itself in the next couple of years is absolutely not happening. And I think Jerome Powell, in so many words, admitted that on his end the other day. So this unraveling, this decentralist impulse, perhaps more than anything, is going to occur simply because the federal government's not going to be able to pay the bills anymore. And we're going to be forced to come up with a new way.